On the morning of June 4, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi and looked out at the sea. The sky was clear. The air was warm. Beneath him, the most powerful carrier strike force in the history of naval warfare was sailing in tight formation across the Central Pacific, approximately 250 kilometers northwest of a small coral atoll called Midway. Nagumo had every reason to feel confident. 18 months earlier, he had led this same force, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, in the attack on Pearl Harbor that had crippled the United States Pacific Fleet in a single morning. He had then led it across the Indian Ocean, striking Ceylon and sinking British warships with a casualness that suggested the Royal Navy was no longer a serious opponent in Asian waters. His pilots had sunk 2 British cruisers and a carrier. They had bombed Colombo and Trincomalee. They had suffered almost no losses in return. Everywhere the Kido Butai had gone, it had won. His air groups were the finest in the world. He believed this not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of documented fact. His carrier pilots had trained for years before the war, some of them accumulating over 1,000 hours of flight time, a level of experience that American naval aviators in the spring of 1942 could not match. His Mitsubishi Zero fighters were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could put in the air. His Aichi dive bombers and Nakajima torpedo bombers had proven themselves in combat from Pearl Harbor to the Bay of Bengal. The American carriers, there were 3 of them somewhere in these waters, according to intelligence reports that Nagumo considered imprecise and probably exaggerated, were a nuisance, a temporary problem, an inconvenience to be swatted aside before Japanese forces completed the capture of Midway and extended the defensive perimeter that Imperial General Headquarters had determined was necessary to protect the home islands. By nightfall on June 4, 1942, all 4 of Nagumo's fleet carriers would be burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the core of the Kido Butai, the instrument of Japan's Pacific dominance, the force that had seemed invincible from Hawaii to Ceylon gone. Sunk by American carrier aircraft in a battle that lasted less than 6 minutes at its decisive moment. The most consequential 6 minutes in the history of naval warfare. What happened at Midway and why Japanese naval commanders so catastrophically failed to anticipate it is a story that begins not in June of 1942 but years earlier, in the institutional attitudes, the intelligence failures, and the profound miscalculations about American character and American capability that shaped every decision the Japanese Navy made in the opening year of the Pacific War. If you're new here and you find yourself drawn into stories like this, the hidden turning points, the moments where certainty became catastrophe, please subscribe. There are dozens more waiting, and we never want you to miss one. To understand the mockery, you have to understand the confidence. And to understand the confidence, you have to understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy had actually accomplished in the decade before Midway, and why those accomplishments seemed to justify a contempt for American naval power that ran all the way from junior officers to fleet admirals. Japan had been building a world-class navy since the 1880s. The decision was deliberate and strategic. An island nation with imperial ambitions in Asia understood that sea power was not optional. The Japanese government sent officers to study in Britain, purchased warships from British and French yards, hired foreign engineers to build domestic shipbuilding facilities, and poured national resources into naval construction with a consistency and discipline that was remarkable even by the standards of the great powers. The investment paid its first dividend in 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Hihikiro Togo's fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Squadron in one of the most lopsided naval victories in modern history. The Russians lost 8 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, and approximately 5,000 men killed. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats. Tsushima was not just a victory. It was a statement, a declaration that Japan had arrived as a first-rank naval power, capable of defeating European forces that had dominated the world's oceans for centuries. The lesson Japanese naval officers drew from Tsushima was specific and deeply held. Decisive battle was the supreme objective of naval strategy. Concentrate your forces, find the enemy fleet, destroy it in a single overwhelming engagement, and the war at sea is won. This doctrine, Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, became the organizing principle of Japanese naval planning for the next 4 decades. Every warship was designed around it. Every training program was shaped by it. Every strategic calculation began with it. In the 1930s, as relations with the United States deteriorated and war began to seem not merely possible but likely, Japanese naval planners developed a specific vision of how a Pacific War would unfold. American forces, they calculated, would sail westward across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines and challenge Japanese control of the Central Pacific. Japanese submarines and land-based aircraft would attrit the American fleet as it advanced. By the time the Americans reached Japanese-controlled waters, they would have been weakened sufficiently to be destroyed in a decisive surface engagement by the Japanese battle line. This was a coherent strategic plan, and it was built on genuine analysis of American capabilities and intentions. But woven through it, at every level of the planning process, was an assumption that influenced every calculation in ways that were rarely stated explicitly and almost never questioned. The assumption was that Americans, as a people and as a military culture, were fundamentally inferior to Japanese in the qualities that determined the outcome of battle. This was not a fringe view. It was consensus. It was expressed in the writing of senior officers, in the culture of the Naval War College, in the informal conversations of the wardrooms of the combined fleet. American sailors were soft, the argument went. They came from a society that valued comfort and individual pleasure over sacrifice and collective discipline. They had not fought a serious war since 1918, and even then, American forces had arrived late and fought relatively briefly compared to the European powers that had been bleeding for 4 years. American naval officers were products of a peacetime navy, promoted through bureaucratic seniority rather than combat merit, trained in exercises that bore little resemblance to real fighting. Japanese naval officers, by contrast, had trained under conditions of deliberate hardship. Their pre-war exercises were designed to be dangerous, not performatively dangerous but genuinely so. Accidents happened. Men died. The view was that this was acceptable, even necessary, because the habits of performance under stress could only be built by actually performing under stress. Japanese destroyer crews trained for night torpedo attacks in weather conditions that Western navies would have considered prohibitive. Japanese pilots flew training missions that pushed aircraft and aviators to the margins of what was survivable. The result, by 1941, was a cadre of naval professionals who were, by any objective measure, extraordinarily skilled. And the result of that skill, combined with the institutional certainty that American sailors could not match it, was a contempt that shaped Japanese strategic thinking in ways that would prove fatal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was the most important figure in the Japanese Navy in the early years of the Pacific War, and he was also one of the most complicated. Yamamoto had lived in the United States twice. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921 and had served as a naval attaché in Washington from 1925 to 1928. He had traveled across the country, visited American factories, observed American social and industrial life with the attentive eye of a professional intelligence officer. He did not share the casual contempt for America that characterized many of his colleagues. He had seen the automobile plants in Detroit. He had seen the steel mills of Pennsylvania. He understood at a visceral level what American industrial capacity meant in terms of war production. He had famously told Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in the months before Pearl Harbor that he could give Japan a year and a half, perhaps 2 years, of victories in the Pacific. After that, he could make no promises. He had seen what America could build. But even Yamamoto's respect for American industrial power did not translate into respect for American fighting quality. He believed, and his colleagues believed with greater fervor, that Japanese sailors and aviators would fight with an intensity and skill that Americans could not match, and that this qualitative advantage would compensate for the quantitative disadvantage that American industry would eventually produce. The plan was to win so decisively in the opening phase of the war that America would negotiate a settlement rather than attempt the enormous effort of reconquest. A few crushing Japanese victories, the argument went, and American public opinion would turn against a costly Pacific War. This was the strategic logic behind Pearl Harbor. Not to destroy American naval power permanently, Yamamoto knew that was impossible, but to buy time, to create facts on the ground across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific, to establish a defensive perimeter so extensive and so costly to assault that America would conclude the price of reconquest was too high. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a tactical masterpiece. 183 Japanese aircraft struck in the first wave, followed by 167 in the second. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged. 347 aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed. Japanese losses were 29 aircraft and 64 men. The disparity was shocking. And in the weeks and months that followed, as Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific with a speed and completeness that even Japanese planners had not fully anticipated, the contempt for American fighting ability seemed confirmed at every turn. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, defended by more than 100,000 troops, fell in 70 days to a Japanese force of roughly 60,000 men advancing on bicycles down the Malay Peninsula. Burma fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Wake Island, defended by a garrison of Marine aviators who shot down Japanese aircraft and sank a destroyer before being overwhelmed, fell. Guam fell in a single day. In the wardrooms of the combined fleet, the mood was something between satisfaction and impatience. The victories were expected. The only question was whether the Americans would be sensible enough to recognize the futility of resistance, or whether they would have to be beaten more thoroughly before they agreed to a negotiated peace. Then came the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, modified to take off from a carrier deck, launched from the USS Hornet approximately 650 kilometers from the Japanese coast and bombed Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The physical damage was minimal. The bombs killed 50 people and destroyed perhaps 90 buildings in a country whose cities held millions. In strict military terms, the raid accomplished almost nothing. In psychological and strategic terms, it accomplished everything. The raid was planned and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT and had set multiple airspeed records before the war. It was approved by President Roosevelt over the objections of officers who considered it operationally marginal. It was executed by volunteers who knew that their aircraft, having launched from a carrier, could not return to one. They would have to fly on to China after the bombing, hoping to land in friendly territory or bail out over Chinese-controlled areas. Japanese air defenses failed to intercept a single aircraft over the target cities. The raiders struck their targets, flew west, and mostly survived, though several crews were captured by Japanese forces in China, and 3 of those men were executed. The carrier force that launched them, Task Force 16 under Vice Admiral William Halsey, withdrew to the east without being detected or engaged. In Japan, the reaction was something close to panic. Not because of the damage was trivial, but because the raid revealed something the Japanese military had assumed was impossible. American carriers had penetrated to within striking distance of the home islands. The Emperor's person had been endangered. The concept of an inviolable inner defensive perimeter, a zone from which American power could be excluded, had been exposed as an illusion. Yamamoto understood the implications immediately. The carriers that had launched the Doolittle Raid, and the carrier force that was somewhere in the Pacific not yet engaged, not yet found and destroyed, represented a threat that could not be ignored. He proposed an operation to draw the American carriers into a decisive engagement at Midway Atoll, the westernmost point of the Hawaiian island chain. Capture Midway, Yamamoto argued, and the Americans would have to sortie their carriers to defend it. When they did, the Kido Butai would be waiting. The plan was approved. The operation was scheduled for June of 1942. And in the weeks of planning that preceded it, the assumptions that had shaped Japanese naval thinking since Tsushima reasserted themselves with full force. American carriers would come. They would fight. They would lose. Because they were Americans, and Americans did not fight as well as Japanese. What Japanese intelligence did not know, what Nagumo did not know as he stood on Akaji's bridge on the morning of June 4th, was that American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications for months. The story of Station HYPO, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, is one of the great intelligence achievements of the war, and it requires some detail to appreciate fully. The Japanese Navy used a cipher system designated JN-25 by American analysts. It was a complex 2-part code. Messages were first encoded using a codebook that substituted 5-digit groups for words and phrases. Then the encoded message was encrypted by adding a second set of 5-digit groups from an additive table. Breaking it required not just mathematical skill but an almost superhuman patience for pattern recognition across thousands of intercepted messages. Commander Joseph Rockefort led the team at Station HYPO. He was an unconventional officer. He wore a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers to work, kept irregular hours, and had a personality that generated friction with superiors in Washington. He was also a cryptanalyst of genius, with an intuitive grasp of Japanese language and thought patterns that allowed him to make inferential leaps that more methodical analysts missed. By the spring of 1942, Rockefort's team had achieved partial solutions to Jan 25. They could not read every message. Many intercepts were still largely unintelligible. But they could read enough fragments, partial texts, call signs, routing indicators to reconstruct the general outlines of Japanese operational planning. And what they were reading in April and May of 1942 pointed unmistakably toward a major operation in the Central Pacific, targeted at a location the Japanese referred to in their messages as AF. The identity of AF was debated within American intelligence. Rockefort believed it was Midway. Officers at Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Washington were not convinced. To resolve the dispute, Rockefort arranged for the Midway garrison to transmit a plain language message reporting a water distillation problem on the island. Days later, a Japanese intelligence report was intercepted stating that AF was experiencing water shortage difficulties. AF was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, accepted Rockefort's analysis and made the decision that shaped everything that followed. He would send his carriers, all three of them, including the Yorktown, which had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea and was estimated to require 90 days of repair, to an ambush position northeast of Midway, where they would be waiting when the Kido Butai arrived. The Yorktown was repaired in 72 hours. Thousands of workers at Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard worked around the clock in 3 shifts. Welders, electricians, pipe fitters, they slept on the ship when they slept at all, ate sandwiches brought to their workstations, and put the carrier back into fighting condition in 3 days. This was not the performance of men who lacked seriousness or commitment. This was American industrial and organizational capacity applied with desperate urgency to a problem that had a fixed deadline. That same urgency had produced another asset that Japanese intelligence had failed to properly account for. The American pilots who would fly from Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet on the morning of June 4th were not the experienced, 1,000-hour veterans that Japanese doctrine assumed would be needed to contest the Kido Butai. Many of them were young men who had earned their wings within the past year, trained in accelerated programs that had compressed peacetime flight instruction into the minimum time compatible with basic competence. Japanese naval aviators had spent years mastering their craft. The men who had flown at Pearl Harbor represented the distilled skill of a decade of intensive pre-war training. By contrast, many of the American aviators at Midway were, by Japanese standards, dangerously inexperienced. This was true, and it did not matter, because the Americans knew where the Japanese were, because Nimitz had positioned his carriers in exactly the right place, because the intelligence that Rockefort's team had extracted from Jan 25 had given the American commanders something more valuable than experience or superior aircraft or numerical equality. It had given them surprise. Nagumo's plan on the morning of June 4th was to strike Midway with a first wave of aircraft, destroying the island's defenses sufficiently to prepare for an amphibious landing. His second wave of aircraft would be held in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to strike American warships if any appeared. It was a sound plan given his assumptions. His assumptions were wrong. The first wave struck Midway at 0632. The island's defenders fought back with desperate courage. Land-based aircraft from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers in repeated waves, achieving essentially nothing against the combat air patrol of Zero fighters that circled the fleet, but demonstrating a ferocity of resistance that surprised Japanese pilots who had expected easier opposition. The commander of the first wave, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, radioed back that a second strike on Midway would be necessary before the island was ready for invasion. Nagumo faced a decision. His reserve aircraft were armed for anti-ship operations. Rearming them with bombs for a second strike on Midway would take time, a minimum of 30 minutes, probably longer. But if no American carriers were present, the risk seemed acceptable. He ordered the rearming to begin. At 0728, A Japanese search aircraft reported American surface ships to the northeast. Nagumo suspended the rearming order. At 0809, the search aircraft's report was corrected. The American force included what appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo was now in a difficult position. His aircraft were in various states of rearming, some with bombs for the Midway strike, some with torpedoes for anti-ship operations. His first wave was returning from Midway and needed to land. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. He made a series of decisions in the next hour that were individually defensible and collectively fatal. He waited for his first wave aircraft to land before launching a strike. He ordered the rearming completed with anti-ship weapons. He maneuvered to close the distance to the American carriers. All of this took time. At 10:22 in the morning, with Akagi's flight deck crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft being prepared for launch, American dive bombers arrived overhead. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not a glamorous aircraft. It was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable, limited in range. American torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese fleet earlier that morning in 3 separate waves, and had been massacred by the Combat Air Patrol. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft, and only 1 pilot survived. The Zero fighters had been drawn down to low altitude by the torpedo attacks, pursuing American aircraft across the water. The dive bombers arrived at high altitude, where there were no Zeros. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey led the Enterprise Air Group. He had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours, his fuel running dangerously low, when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer heading north at high speed toward the main fleet. He followed it. He found the carriers. McCluskey divided his group and attacked. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the Yorktown Air Group against Soryu. In the space of approximately 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28, American dive bombers placed bombs on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Each carrier was hit multiple times, the bombs detonating among the parked aircraft, igniting fuel and ordnance in catastrophic secondary explosions that tore through the ships from within. Akagi was the flagship of the Kido Butai, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. She had been built on a battlecruiser hull, displacing over 36,000 tons at full load. She carried approximately 60 aircraft. She had sailed from Hawaii to Ceylon and back without suffering a scratch. She had, in the minds of her crew and her commanders, a quality approaching invincibility, not supernatural but practical, the invincibility of a weapon that had been tested in combat and had never failed. A single bomb hit from McCluskey's dive bombers struck her flight deck near the midship elevator. The explosion ignited the fueled and armed aircraft crowded on the hangar deck below. Within minutes, secondary explosions were tearing through the ship. Nagumo had to be physically helped off the bridge as the fire spread. He transferred his flag to a cruiser. Akagi burned through the day and into the night, and her crew scuttled her the following morning. Kaga was struck by 4 bombs. The first hit her flight deck near the bow, killing everyone in the bridge structure. The remaining hits ignited fuel and ordnance in a series of explosions that made the ship uncontrollable within minutes. She sank that afternoon. Soryu was struck by 3 bombs in quick succession. She was abandoned within 20 minutes of the first hit and sank that evening. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, survived the initial attack because she was operating separately from the other 3. Her aircraft struck back, hitting Yorktown twice. The American carrier survived the first attack, but was struck again by a second wave that left her dead in the water. Hiryu's reprieve was brief. American dive bombers found her that afternoon and put 4 bombs into her flight deck. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, 292 aircraft, and approximately 3,500 men, including, critically, a large portion of the skilled maintenance technicians and ordnance handlers who kept carrier air groups functioning, men whose expertise took years to develop and could not be quickly replaced. The human cost is worth dwelling on because it gets at something that the strategic analysis often misses. The Japanese Navy that fought at Midway was, in a real sense, not replaceable. The carriers could eventually be replaced. Japan laid down new ones, American shipyards laid down more. The arithmetic of industrial production would play itself out over the next 3 years. But the men who had trained since the 1930s, who had accumulated thousands of hours of flight time, who had learned the specific and demanding craft of carrier aviation before the war, those men could not be replicated on a production line. American training programs were already running at full capacity, pushing pilots through accelerated courses and getting them to fleet units within a year. Those pilots lacked the experience of their Japanese counterparts. But there were many of them, and more were coming every month, and the institutional knowledge required to train them existed and was being applied with American organizational efficiency. Japan's pilot training programs were not structured for mass production. The same perfectionism that had created the exceptional aviators of the Kido Butai was a barrier to rapid expansion. Japanese training culture did not easily accommodate the necessary compromises between individual excellence and the volume of trained pilots that a long war would require. Each man lost at Midway represented years of investment that Japan did not have the time or the institutional capacity to replace. The admirals who had mocked American sailors, who had argued in the planning sessions and wardroom conversations of the pre-war years that American naval culture produced men who were too comfortable, too individually focused, too unserious to fight effectively, began to encounter, in the months after Midway, evidence that complicated that assessment. The sailors who kept Yorktown fighting after the first Japanese attack were not acting from an ethos of collective sacrifice in the Japanese sense. They were acting from something harder to categorize: professional pride, certainly, and unit loyalty, and something like American stubbornness, a refusal to accept that a damaged ship was a lost ship, a belief that problems existed to be solved rather than accepted. Damage control teams flooded compartments, shored up bulkheads, restored power, got the ship's boilers working again after hits that Japanese damage control doctrine would have led the crew to consider fatal. Yorktown was hit again. She was eventually sunk 4 days after the battle by a Japanese submarine. But the fact that she was still afloat to be hit a second and third time, the fact that her crew kept her fighting when any reasonable assessment would have said she was finished, revealed something about American naval character that the pre-war mockery had missed entirely. The intelligence machinery that had made the ambush possible also deserved examination as evidence of American capability. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematical skill but organizational persistence. The willingness to keep working on a problem for months without guaranteed results. To maintain institutional support for a unit whose product was inherently difficult to assess until it was proven by events. Rockefeller's team at Station HYPO operated under conditions of intense pressure and with limited resources. They succeeded because of individual brilliance, certainly, but also because the organizational culture of the American Navy in 1942 had room for unconventional approaches and tolerated the friction that genuinely creative people generate. The Japanese intelligence apparatus, by contrast, had failed in ways that reflected its own institutional assumptions. The pre-war contempt for American fighting ability had infected the analysis of American capabilities. Japanese planners had assumed the Americans would not have adequate warning of the Midway operation. They had assumed American damage control would not keep Yorktown operational after Coral Sea. They had assumed the American Combat Air Patrol would prevent effective dive bomber attacks on the carriers. Every assumption was wrong. And the assumptions were wrong in part because they were shaped by a prior conviction that Americans were not serious enough, not disciplined enough, not skilled enough to do the things they would need to do to make those assumptions wrong. This is the deepest lesson of Midway, and it is not primarily a lesson about tactics or technology or even intelligence. It is a lesson about the epistemological danger of contempt. When you have decided in advance that your enemy is inferior, you systematically discount evidence that contradicts that judgment. You assume their apparent competence is luck or circumstance rather than genuine capability. You fail to prepare for outcomes that your prior beliefs have rendered unthinkable. If this kind of deep historical analysis is something you value, stories that go beyond the surface of events to examine why things happen the way they did, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who would appreciate it. It genuinely helps these stories reach the audience they deserve. In the weeks after Midway, as the full dimensions of the disaster became clear to the Japanese High Command, the institutional response was revealing. The defeat was classified at the highest levels of secrecy. Survivors were kept isolated to prevent information from spreading. Wounded men from the sunken carriers were treated in special wards, separated from other patients. The public was told of a great Japanese victory in the Central Pacific. Midway was not mentioned. This secrecy was not simply propaganda management. It reflected something deeper, an inability to process the defeat within the existing framework of assumptions. If Japanese naval power was inherently superior to American, if Japanese fighting spirit was a genuine military asset that compensated for material disadvantage, then Midway could not be what it appeared to be. The loss of 4 carriers in a single day to an enemy that Japanese doctrine regarded as qualitatively inferior was not just a military disaster. It was an epistemological crisis. Yamamoto, who understood the implications better than almost anyone else in the Japanese command structure, wrote to a colleague in the weeks after Midway that the war was now going to be decided by production, by the number of ships and aircraft that could be built, and the rate at which trained men could be produced to crew them. He had believed this before the war. It was why he had warned against fighting America, but he had hoped the opening campaigns would create a strategic situation favorable enough to Japan that production would be less decisive. Midway eliminated that hope. The arithmetic was brutal and inexorable. In the year following Midway, American shipyards would launch more tonnage of warships than the entire existing Japanese fleet. American aircraft factories, converted from automobile production, were manufacturing combat aircraft at a rate that Japanese industry could not approach. American flight training programs were producing pilots by the thousands. Japan was producing skilled pilots by the dozens. By 1943, the qualitative advantage that Japanese naval aviation had held at the beginning of the war had been eroded to near parity in some areas and reversed in others. By 1944, when American forces invaded the Marianas and the 2 carrier fleets met again in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots were flying aircraft that were in some respects technically inferior to American ones, and they were dramatically less experienced than their American opponents. The result was a slaughter so one-sided that American pilots nicknamed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 476 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Americans lost 29. The men who had mocked American sailors in the wardrooms of the pre-war combined fleet had not been entirely wrong about the state of American naval aviation in 1941. American pilots in the first year of the war were, on average, less experienced than their Japanese opponents. American aircraft in some categories were inferior. American tactical doctrine had serious deficiencies that took months of combat to identify and correct. What the mockers had been wrong about was the capacity for change. American pilots who survived their early encounters with the Japanese learned, adapted, and improved. American aircraft designers incorporated lessons from combat reports and produced new designs. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, introduced in late 1943, was specifically engineered to defeat the Zero with a more powerful engine, heavier armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 650 caliber machine guns. It was not as maneuverable as the Zero in a turning dogfight. American pilots were trained not to turn with Zeros. The Hellcat was faster in a dive, had a higher ceiling, and could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. American pilots learned to use these advantages. The organizational culture that allowed this adaptation was itself a form of military capability that Japanese doctrine had not accounted for. The ability to take losses, analyze them honestly, identify the tactical and technical causes, and implement systematic changes across a large force. This required an institutional honesty about failure that Japanese military culture found profoundly difficult. Japanese officers who reported bad news risked their careers and sometimes more. The culture of Haji shame made honest assessment of failure a dangerous act. After Midway, the officers responsible for the intelligence failures and tactical misjudgments that had contributed to the disaster were quietly reassigned rather than publicly investigated. The institutional lessons of the defeat were never fully extracted because extracting them would have required acknowledging them. American military culture was not free of similar tendencies. Political considerations influenced promotion and assignment decisions. Careers were damaged by honest reporting, and there were plenty of instances where institutional pride suppressed useful self-criticism. But the American system had more tolerance for failure as a source of information and more capacity for rapid adjustment based on that information than the Japanese system in the crisis years of 1942 and 43. The result was an asymmetry in institutional learning that compounded the asymmetry in industrial production. Japan could not build ships and aircraft fast enough to replace its losses. It could not train pilots fast enough to replace the men killed in the expanding battles across the Pacific. and it could not adapt its doctrine and tactics fast enough to address the specific advantages that American forces were developing and exploiting. The admirals who had mocked American sailors were encountering, battle by battle, the consequences of having misjudged not just American capability but American character, the specific combination of pragmatism, adaptability, organizational competence, and industrial energy that defined American military culture at its best. None of this is to suggest that American forces were uniformly excellent, or that Japanese forces were simply outmatched from the beginning. The Pacific War was fought for 3.5 years over an ocean larger than all of Earth's landmasses combined. Japanese soldiers and sailors fought with a courage and commitment that was genuine and extraordinary. Individual Japanese commanders demonstrated tactical skill and operational creativity that American commanders had to work hard to counter. But the arc of the war from Midway onward was determined less by individual engagement outcomes than by the underlying dynamics that Yamamoto had tried to warn his government about and that Nagumo, on the morning of June 4th, had not yet been forced to confront. When Nagumo's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryanosuke Kosaka, wrote his post-war account of the Battle of Midway, he identified the critical error not as a tactical mistake, the rearming decision, the failure to maintain adequate air search coverage, but as a failure of imagination. The Japanese Navy had not seriously prepared for the possibility of defeat at Midway because it had not seriously believed defeat was possible. That belief, grounded in institutional confidence, reinforced by 6 months of unbroken victory, and shaped by a prior conviction that Americans were not serious opponents, had made the Japanese fleet vulnerable in a way that no amount of tactical skill could entirely overcome. The ping of an empty en-bloc clip ejecting from an M1 Garand, heard on the firing ranges of Manila in May 1942, was one kind of warning. The dive bombers arriving over Akagi on the morning of June 4th were another. Both said the same thing in different registers to those willing to hear it. The Americans were more capable than you assumed, they were learning faster than you expected, and the gap between what you believed about them and what they actually were would cost you everything. The Type 4 rifle that Japanese engineers labored over at Yokosuka Arsenal, produced in the end in numbers so small as to be militarily meaningless, and the 4 burning carriers that lit the night sky over Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942, are linked by the same thread. Japan saw the problem clearly. Japan's engineers and analysts wrote honest reports about the firepower gap, about the intelligence failure, about the industrial disparity. The reports existed. The analysis was sound. Knowing about a problem and solving it are two different things. And between knowing and solving lay the full weight of institutional assumptions, cultural rigidities, and material constraints that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The admirals who had mocked American sailors were not stupid men. They were, many of them, genuinely skilled naval officers. What they lacked was not intelligence but imagination, the capacity to take seriously the possibility that their prior judgments were wrong, that the enemy they had dismissed was capable of things their doctrine said were impossible, that the war they had planned for was not the war they were going to get. Midway was the moment that gap became undeniable. From that morning in June 1942, the arc of the Pacific War bent inexorably toward its conclusion. Not because of those 6 minutes over the Kido Butai, dramatic as they were, but because of what those 6 minutes revealed about the two nations that were fighting, about their capacity for honest self-assessment, their ability to learn and adapt, their willingness to invest in the unglamorous work of intelligence and logistics and damage control and production that determined, in the end, who came home and who did not. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking differently about how wars are won and lost, please leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community reaches from the Philippines to Finland, from veterans to students to people who just love history told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next story.